tonight. Thank you for the students that we have. We pray for those that are traveling. We pray that those who are watching via streaming. We ask, Lord, that you just encourage us to help us to learn. Okay, so the homework was Domitian. What did we learn about Domitian? Yes. Hmm? He was very good. Had 2 legs, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. What else do we know about him? What do you know about Domitian? Sorry. I'm sorry too, because my mic's not on. Turn my mic on. There we go. All right, so Domitian is probably most famous for being the guy that put John the Apostle out on the Isle of Patmos. And according to church history, the way that came about was that he wanted to kill John the Apostle, and so they put him in a pot of boiling oil. And according to church tradition, John the Apostle came out as if he had just taken a nice long hot bath. And that kind of freaked Domitian out and said, well, if we can't kill him, we need to just get him out of here. So he put him out on the island. Okay? So that's Domitian. And that's important for us to know what kind of character he had, because we're going to look at some things on that. So we are at the post-apostolic period, AD 100 to AD 300. At this point, the whole New Testament has been written. However, having said that, the whole New Testament has not been circulated yet. That probably didn't happen for another 20 or 30 years after this point. We don't know exactly how long after. We do know that by 140, I think it's 147 or so, because of heresy that was going on, somebody made a list and said, these are the books that we accept. And they named just about every, as far as I can remember, they named just about every New Testament book in the list. So anyway, as we have been following along, we look at 2 sections for each period. The first section we look at is the problems of the time, and then the second section we look at is the people. And so the problems of the time, there are 5 different problems that they faced. 1, 2, 3, 4 of those problems deal with false doctrine, okay? And the first one, of course, is persecution. They face persecution through the next 200 and some years. And so that's where we're picking up at. And then after that, sacerdotalism, false teachings on baptism, false teaching concerning salvation, and false teaching concerning the nature of Christ. And we'll look at all of that as we go through this. So, the reigns of Domitian. Under the reigns of Domitian, who, remember what I just said about Domitian, he was definitely not a nice man. And Trajan, who was another emperor. The New Testament churches enter into the 2nd century, and there's a lot of persecution going on. And the 2nd century didn't look very hopeful. If you were a believer in the 2nd century, you just knew when you went from whatever you were to professing faith in Christ, you knew what that meant. That meant that you were going to be persecuted and maybe even martyred. And that's what happened a lot during this time period. So a lot of believers were actually martyred during that time period. And the Roman emperors were behind a lot of it. So it's not just the Jews anymore. Now the Roman Empire is also martyring believers at a very rapid rate. Later, when we get to the next section, when we start looking at the next time period, we're going to talk about a guy whose name is Diocletian. He stands out in my mind as being one of the absolute most brutal, one of the worst. but that's opinion, so we'll see how that goes. The second century. By the end of the second century, they were struggling with the practice of sacerdotalism. And what that is, basically, is the separation of the clergy from the laity. Now, I don't really like using those words at all because I don't think in those terms, but there are a lot of churches that think in these terms. And the idea there is that the clergy and the laity are separate, and that the clergy is, of course, higher and better, and et cetera, and so on and so forth. Does the Bible tell us to respect the spiritual leadership? Yes or no? Yes? Okay, so if I'm supposed to respect my spiritual leadership, does that mean that there should be a separation between the leadership and the people in a church? Okay, explain. Okay. Okay, so role does not equal value. We have different roles, no doubt, in a church. Everybody has a different role, but that doesn't in any way reflect on a person's value. But with sacerdotalism, it draws a separation between the people and their leader in ways that greatly hindered discipleship. Remember how Jesus did it. He walked and talked and ate and most likely slept on the same piece of ground as his apostles. And there was definitely the separation along the lines of, well, that's Jesus, he's the Lord, and we are, his disciples. But if you separate the leadership from the people, then the leader cannot effectively, spiritually lead the people. I have seen churches, this happens a lot in really big churches. Sometimes it's just because it is a really big church, but you'll find that there are churches where the people and the pastor do not even know each other. And I can't fathom how that could be the case, but it is the case. And I try to imagine what it would be like to be the pastor of a church that had, 4,000 or 5,000 people. And there are churches that big. How can I know? I might know by face, but how can I know them? How can I know what they're dealing with? How can I know where they are in their spiritual life? How can I encourage them and help them to grow? It's very, very difficult, and I would say probably almost impossible. So what do? Leaders in churches that are that big, if they really want to minister at the individual level, they end up appointing men to lead groups of those people. And so that's really the only way that can be done. But in sacerdotalism, even that's not possible, because the clergy is always the clergy, and the laity is always the laity, and there is that separation there. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's look at verses 2 and 3. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. And Brother Benjamin, you want to read that when you get there?
Be the command of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint willingly, not for filthy liquor, but of the ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock.
All right, so working through these verses, Peter writes to those who are elders or leaders or pastors, and he gives them some instruction. The first part of that instruction is to feed the flock of God which is among you. Then he tells them to take the oversight. In other words, take your leadership position. But he balances that in verse 3 by saying, not as a lord over God's heritage, but as an example. I don't like that verse. Do you know why I don't like that verse? Because there are days when I don't feel like I'm a very good example. But that doesn't change the requirement. Whether a pastor or a spiritual leader in the church feels as if he's been a good example that day, he is an example anyway, right? So if you see me doing something, we'll talk about driving, because driving is a spiritual journey for me. All right? Now, if you're riding with me and you see me speeding all the time, don't you feel like you'd be more prone to speeding because, after all, the pastor does it? Yeah, that would be a bad example. So you're going to set an example one way or the other, either good or bad, right? The thing is, with sacerdotalism, they are lords over God's heritage. And notice in verse 2, going back to verse 2, he says, not by constraint, but willingly. In other words, you're not doing it because you have to. You're willingly leading your people, not for filthy lucre. What's lucre? Maybe you're familiar with the word lucrative. Something looks lucrative. Money. Yeah, gain. It's referring to money. So not for filthy lucre. In other words, you're not doing your job for money, but of a ready mind. So that has to be the heart of a real pastor. Okay? There's a lot of pastors out there that are not like this at all. I have heard stories. I've not personally been under men like this. If I ever thought that I was, I would have changed. But I've heard stories of pastors that told their church, if you don't pay me or you don't pay me more, I'm going to quit. To me, that says that this verse is not real to them. Sacerdotalism, this separation, what happens? Well, it also led to the breakdown of the priesthood of the believers. It began to be accepted that the leaders could somehow gain greater access to God than the people could. One of my favorite preachers that I like to listen to, they have him on BBN still. His name is Lehman Strauss. And Lehman Strauss is a Jewish man who got saved, and he has a way of teaching. It's just very clear. I wouldn't call it shallow at all. He's not excessively deep, but he does a good job. And he was teaching on prayer, and he said that a woman came to him and asked him to pray for, I think her husband or somebody was dying. And so he said, I will pray for him, ma'am, but aren't you praying for him? And she said, well, yes, I am, but I mean, you're the pastor and you're a preacher, and you know, I just really want you to pray for him, as if somehow the pastor's prayers are more powerful than the people's prayers. That is not at all true. My prayers are limited by my faith just as much as the next guy's. My prayers are empowered by my faith just as much as the next guy's. So whether you just got saved yesterday and you can't even find the book of Psalms, or if you've been saved for 40 years and you know the Bible inside out, doesn't matter. When it comes to approaching God, we all have that same Baptist distinctive. We all have the priesthood of the believers. We all have individual soul liberty, and therefore we are all able to approach God equally. I'm sorry, can you wait in line? there's a pastor speaking to me and I need to God doesn't operate that way. So God doesn't practice the same idea of separation between the clergy and the laity. Now, I will give you that oftentimes, because a pastor is a pastor, that he is going to be a little more sensitive toward his walk, his daily walk. This becomes very clear to me on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Because on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I know that I have to teach or preach God's Word. And you better believe that I'm trying my best all day to make sure that when I get in the pulpit, whenever that time comes, that I am spiritually ready, that the devil has not knocked me around and gotten me carnal. So maybe if you catch me on a Sunday or a Wednesday or Friday, maybe I might be more spiritual than you, and maybe my prayers might be more effective than yours because you are carnal and I'm not. But other than that, it doesn't make any difference. All right? Any questions on that? Because sacerdotalism is a big problem. Teachers of the Scriptures during this time period that we're looking at began to use object lessons as the influence of allegorical interpretation. Let's pause there for a moment because we need to understand what an allegory is. Who can tell me what's an allegory? No? Nothing there? Googling it? Okay, let me make it easy for you. An allegory is when we take a story and then we apply a spiritual meaning to that story so that that story teaches as its primary interpretation something that it wasn't really teaching or not really saying. A good example would be that now allegories are not necessarily wrong, okay? There are in the Bible allegories. In fact, the book of Galatians mentions an allegory, and it speaks of the two mountains, and it speaks of two women as being allegories, okay? But not to get too far off on that, the thing is, they were making allegories out of things that shouldn't be allegories, all right? And we have to be very careful with that because we can take an object to teach an object lesson, and there's a lot of people that do that, but sometimes it can lead to an undue emphasis placed on the object, and the object now becomes an icon. The Catholic Church is big on icons. There's the heads of Baptists all over the world, John the Baptist all over the world, and they've got this part of Thomas and that part of Peter and this and that and the other thing, and they're all over the place. And they reverence those things. They revere it to the point where it's almost like they worship it. And I would say that just about do worship it. All right. A good example would be the cross. I personally have a respect for the cross. If you were to take the cross off the wall and throw it into the floor, it would bother me. I wouldn't like that. However, this cross is not the cross that Jesus died on. This cross is made out of completely different wood than the wood that Jesus died on. This cross is just a symbol, but it is not to be worshipped. And you and I both know that there are people that practically worship the cross. There are people that worship a lot of things. Well, what is to be the object of our worship? The object of our worship is to be the Lord. And so anytime you start having that sort of problem, you're going to lead the people the wrong way. All right, let's move on. Along with this, now let's get into the idea of false teachings concerning baptism and false teachings concerning salvation. They're kind of intertwined because they began to teach baptism as a means to receive some spiritual grace and sometimes even salvation itself. In other words, when you got baptized, somehow God blessed you with a second blessing of grace. Or maybe you got saved when you were baptized, baptismal regeneration. And so when that happens, what does that make baptism? That makes baptism a work for salvation. which means that salvation suddenly now becomes the result of works and not of grace. And the Bible clearly says that if it is of works, it is not of grace. We cannot work our way to heaven. You know, I've met people that, you know, have had this idea that if I just stop sinning today and I live the rest of my life without sinning, and then I die, I'm going to go to heaven. Well, what's wrong with that concept? Well, the fact is, if you live to be 100 years old and you stopped sinning when you were 30, you still got 30 years of sin there that needs to be, you know, washed away and forgiven. So turning over a new leaf doesn't do anything for you. Salvation must be by grace, and we must protect that doctrine because there are a lot of ways and a lot of heresies that would come in and try to impact upon that. So once the heresies began, now imagine that you are in a church at the turn of the 2nd century. Once the heresies began, then they began to multiply. And one false teaching led to another. And so going back to baptism, since baptism imparted grace, the natural thought was to begin baptizing infants. That's called pedobaptism, so that that infant would be sealed for life. And that was a major thing, and that was one of the reasons why they were killing people that held to Baptistic doctrine, because we would not baptize babies. And so they would look at us and they'd say, what kind of evil, wicked person can you be? You don't even care about your child enough to get him baptized so that he can be saved? Because they believed that baptism would seal them for life. Of course, we know that that's not true, but that's what they thought. This also led to the practice of sprinkling instead of immersion. Why? Well, because it's pretty unwise to hold a baby underwater, so they started sprinkling. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, there were people thinking that baptism washed away sin. So what would they do? That they would wait their whole life until they knew that they were just about ready to die, and then they would get baptized. Well, you can't take a man who is 90 years old and he's in his sick bed and he's about to die. You don't take him out of the bed and take him down to the river and immerse him. That'll definitely kill him. So what were they doing? They were sprinkling, because they believed that baptism would wash away the sins. If you have the book, here's some quotations of note from early church writers concerning baptism. And this is something Justin Martyr said this. He said, as many as are persuaded and believe that those things which are taught by us are true and do promise to live according to them are directed first to pray and ask God with fasting the forgiveness of their sins. So what is he saying? He's saying, first get saved. And we also pray and fast together with them. Then we bring them to some place where there is water, and they are regenerated by the same way of regeneration by which we were regenerated, for they are washed in the name of the Father. And, you know, if you've got the book, you can see that that's a section that's underlined, and I wanted to emphasize what he said there. So Justin Martyr obviously put more emphasis on receiving baptism than God did. According to the Bible, baptism is a picture of the death, the burial, and the resurrection. When we get baptized, we are identifying with Christ in his death, his burial, and the resurrection. Now, we don't die when we're baptized. Do we? No, we died before that, right? We died to self before that. It's called salvation. We don't die at baptism. We're not buried at baptism, certainly not, except buried under the water. And we certainly do not experience a supernatural resurrection like Christ did. So when we say that we are identified with Christ in his death, his burial, and his resurrection, we are talking about the fact that baptism is a picture of that very doctrinal teaching. And we are identifying with that. We're saying, I am in agreement with that teaching. Also, baptism is a step of obedience. So for us, it is about obedience. It is about a picture. But you go into that water and you come back out, and the only extra thing you get is wet. That's the only extra thing that you get. Or maybe cold if it happens to be in the wintertime. And did I ever tell you about George Garnett? His hat's hanging on the wall over here somewhere. I don't know exactly where his hat's at right this present moment. But George Garnett came to Kunsan. He was a staff sergeant, I believe, and came down to the Haven and just loved the preaching of the Word. And he came from a charismatic background. Now, understand that charismatics, many charismatic churches teach salvation by faith, by God's grace. They teach it just like we do, salvation. After that, they kind of get off on a wrong tangent concerning the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So he came in from a church that taught salvation by faith, but he had these ideas concerning, the gifts of the Spirit. So I remember the day that we sat down on the sofa and we went through the scriptures talking about that sort of thing. And so he finally came to the conclusion that that sort of teaching was unbiblical. It was wrong. And with that, he says, well, in that case, I need to get baptized. And I said, okay, let's do it. Now, in those days, we would rent a bathhouse at night. After they closed, we'd go in after they closed, and we'd clean out one of the tubs real good and fill it with water, and we'd baptize in one of those bathhouses. And it was really great because, you baptize them, and at the end, we'd all sing Amazing Grace and the tile and the echo, and it was awesome. But he didn't want to do that. I wanted to do that because bathhouses are warm. He didn't want to do that. No, he wanted to get baptized in Lake Umpa in February. February. January, February. Let me tell you what February means in English. Cold. That's what it means in English. I said, okay, we'll do that. I'm thinking he's going to get the worst of it. So we went down there, the whole church, we all loaded up and went down there, and we got down the water. And I stepped down in the water first, and I got into the water about this deep, up to my knees. And I'm not kidding you, my feet and my calves went numb. The water was so cold. I was in pain, and my thighs, they weren't even wet yet. They're already aching from the cold. And I looked over at George. He hadn't quite gotten in yet. He was just working his way down in there. I looked over at George and I said, are you sure? I was hoping he'd say, never mind, let's do it in a bathhouse. But no, that's not what he said. So he came on down, and we got on down there, and now I'm in the water up to here. I can't feel anything. And I baptized him. And I'm telling you what, he came up out of there. We ran to the bathroom so we could change clothes and get dry and get warm. It was cold. What would possess a man to do something like that? Well, he just knew he needed to. He wanted to obey the Lord. It was really just that simple. Now, Irenaeus, getting back to the quote, Irenaeus, he put more emphasis on baptism than God did. He also believed that parents ought to dedicate their children to God at a young age by way of baptism. Now, if you live in a society or at a time when everybody believes that baptism saves you, and then you take your young child and you take him down and you get him baptized, which by then, was probably by sprinkling, that child grows up thinking that they're saved when they're not. So what are they going to do? Well, whatever they want to do because they already think they're saved. And they're not. And Irenaeus believed that. He was a Greek by birth. He was liberally educated. Before he accepted the pastorate of Lyons, he lived at Smyrna under the instruction of Polycarp. I should give you a homework assignment on Polycarp, but I won't. Polycarp was one of John the Apostle's personal disciples. Now, I know John the Apostle taught baptism right. I am pretty sure that Polycarp taught it right. But somewhere along the line, Irenaeus was affected by heresy. And so during his time, he began to believe some of the things that others were believing, at least to a certain extent. And Christians during that time were martyred in every form imaginable. The following passage is said to refer to baptism, and again, this is a quote by Irenaeus. He said, "Christ passed through all ages of men, that he might save all by himself." We call that universalism, by the way. "All I say, who by him are regenerated to God, infants and little ones, and children and youths and persons advanced in years." Now, why would Irenaeus say that infants and little ones were regenerated? Because he believed in baptismal regeneration, at least to a certain extent. He's clearly talking about regeneration. He was agitated by the conduct of some who thought it needless to bring the person to the water at all, but mixing oil and water together, they poured it on the candidate's head. So, if we could say anything about Irenaeus, we could at least say that he believed that it ought to be by water, by immersion. He didn't like the idea that they were getting sprinkled by oil or water. So we'll give him that much, but he still put way too much emphasis on some sort of second grace or some regenerative power in baptism. So it would seem like he did not like the sacrament of pouring or sprinkling. Okay, so let's move on to the next quote. This one is by a man named Clement of Alexandria. And he said this. He said, "The baptized ought to be children in malice, but not in understanding. Even such children who, as the children of God, have put off the old man with the garments of wickedness and have put on the new man." Now, Clement was not talking about literal children here. We know that because he goes on to say that they are not in understanding. They're children of God. They put off the old man and have put on the new man. So even as liberal as the school of Alexandria was, and let me pause there for a moment, and let's get back on the idea of allegory just for a moment. And I want to kind of bring in some other areas to help you understand the situation that they were living in. By the 2nd and 3rd century, there were two major schools or areas of theology. One of them was in the area of Antioch, and the other was in the area of Alexandria. So if you study textual analysis at all, you'll learn that some of the manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, are called Alexandrian manuscripts. Others are called Byzantine manuscripts from the Byzantine area, the Byzantine Empire. In Alexandria, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of the manuscripts that come out of the area of Alexandria are riddled with differences and mistakes and so forth, because the literal word for word thing wasn't as big of a deal in Alexandria. They held to allegorical teaching. So as long as you get the meaning, it's okay. So they were getting the meaning in Alexandria, and here is this man Clement, who is in Alexandria, and as liberal as the school of Alexandria was, it appears that they at least still stood for believers' baptism. So we conclude that there was some influence, but at the same time, very little change to the mode or the subjects of baptism that leads us into the 3rd century. The 2nd century produced for us some very important, some people like to call them church fathers. I don't like to say that because Jesus said not to call any man father, in reference to spiritual leaders. And so I don't particularly like to say that. I would rather say early church writers, and that's kind of what I say most of the time. but I always have to explain what I'm talking about, so now you know. Men like Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Theophilus of Antioch, Tatian, and so on. None of them even so much as mention infant baptism. And we've got quite a few writings, a lot of things that have been written, but they don't talk about infant baptism. So we can conclude that this heresy of infant baptism or baptismal regeneration had not really begun to take root, though it may have been practiced by a few fringe groups. And you can find fringe groups that were doing it, but by and large, it was still baptism by immersion. Okay? Any questions on that before we move on? Because now it's about to get really boring. If it wasn't boring enough already, it's about to really get boring, because now we're going to talk about monarchianism. I think that's how it's said. I've actually never heard anybody say the word. It might be monarchianism. It might be monarchianism. I'm just going to say monarchianism. When my daughter was growing up, she had the same problem that I'm having right now, and she called it the monarch butterfly. The monarch, yes, it's not the monarch, it's the monarch butterfly. So I don't know. I'm in the same boat with her now. I don't know if it's monarchianism or monarchianism, but the word is there in your notes for you. You can see the word, figure out how you want to say it the next time you decide to say the word. Anyway, monarchianism means rule of one, and probably originated in Asia Minor. That's where it seems to have come from. It taught that the Father alone possessed true personality. The Son and the Holy Spirit were impersonal attributes of the Godhead. Only the Father possessed personality. Well, clearly that impacts the teaching of the Trinity, right? In their view, the power of God came upon the man Jesus and then gradually penetrated and deified his humanity. In other words, Jesus was a man who became God. That somehow the power of God came on him and just kind of soaked into him somehow until he became the God-man. This is monarchianism. You and I both know that Jesus was always God. He was born God in the flesh. But monarchianism doesn't teach that. Jesus was, in their view, not to be considered God in the true sense of the word. So, is Jesus God? Yeah, he's God, but not really God. You know, he's kind of a lesser God maybe, or he has God power, but he's not God, you know. And so that's monarchianism. Another form of monarchianism was the Unitarian or dynamic monarchian heresy. And this heresy, which was not all that widespread, but it has certainly revived in times since then. In other words, we can find that being prevalent in some places today. It held that God was God and that Jesus was a man indwelt by God or God's Spirit at the time of his baptism. So, in other words, Jesus was a man, but he was indwelt by the Spirit of God, which made him God. Now, according to that teaching, which is heresy, we're all gods. Because the Spirit indwelt us. You see the fallacy of that? Now, I'm not a God. I can tell you right now, I'm not a God. If I was a God, I'd make myself a Corvette right there in the parking lot. But I'm not a God. So that's not happening, right? No matter how possessed we may be by the Spirit of God, we are not God. So this is clearly a false teaching. So in monarchianism, it was wrong to say that Jesus was God. There are televangelists who go around. Kenneth Copeland's one of the big ones. He doesn't mind telling you. He describes himself having a conversation with God the Father. And in this conversation, he understands that God tells him that he could have died on the cross too. Because he was a little God. That dude is off his rocker. I think he's possessed. I really believe he's demonic. And he's misleading thousands of people, all right? So monarchianism, it's wrong to say that Jesus was God. He's just, less than God somehow. That leads us up to the next one, modalism. Any questions on monarchianism before we move on? Nope. Moving on. Modalism. This one is alive and well on planet Earth today. Anybody ever hear of T.D. Jakes? T.D. Jakes. He's a modalist. Big time. He says he's changed, but then he keeps talking like a modalist. So I don't know what he changed because his teaching is basically the same. Yes. Modalism at the same time, now remember what we're talking about. We're talking about the 2nd century, okay? Modalism is also now becoming a doctrinal problem. And we still have those who hold to modalistic positions today. And if we are not careful, we will unwittingly, let me say it that way, or not meaningly, we can express modalistic teaching. For example, have you ever heard any of the good teachings on trying to understand the Trinity? Water. Because water, it can be water, or it can be gas, or it can be ice, right? But the problem is, the gas is never water, and the solid is never gas. The ice is never gas, right? So the ice never becomes steam. The steam is not water. The water is not ice, and ice is not steam. So with water, though we may want to use that as an illustration, I would recommend you not do that because you are impressing in people's minds unwittingly. You're not trying to do it, but you're basically teaching modalism. It's the same thing with the egg. I heard the egg analogy, right? Because you got the shell, and then you got the white, and you got the yolk. But the yolk is never the white, and the white is never the shell. But in the teaching of the Trinity, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. There is one God. Can we understand that? No. But we can believe it, and the Scriptures teach it, right? I understand it with math. 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. That's how I understand it. If you go 1 plus 1 plus 1, you're going to have a problem, okay? That would be modalism, all right? So this heresy, which is much closer to orthodoxy than monarchianism, has been held wittingly and unwittingly by many sincere Christians up to this present day. And probably not a year goes by that I don't hear some well-meaning, otherwise decent man of God unwittingly teaching modalism. They're not trying to. They don't mean it. If you break it down to them and ask them, oh, so do you mean that the ice and the steam are, they're the same? Well, they are in water, and water is, but there's really no good physical illustration of this spiritual truth. So I would advise you not to try to come up with one because I haven't seen one in 40 years that's been workable yet. So we have to be careful with that. Modalism preserves the unity of God. It preserves the full deity of Christ. It claims that the one God is known as a Trinity because of his 3, and this is where it goes wrong, his 3 modes of action. In other words, God sometimes acts as the Father, and then other times he acts as the Son, and then other times he acts as the Holy Spirit. That's modalism, and it's a false teaching. As far as we know, a man named Noetus of Smyrna in the late 2nd century was the first one to propose this teaching. He was condemned, but the teaching spread, and then later it was systematized by a man named Sabellius, And that happened in the early 3rd century. Now, Sabellius was excommunicated in Rome. Some viewed the three persons of the Godhead as expression, activity, or ways of describing God. They were not, in their minds, distinct divine persons. Divine persons, yes. But distinct, no. So, it would be like me. In the morning, I wake up in the morning and I'm a pastor. I go to my office and I sit in my office and I do my pastor thing. Then I go to help out at the school because Chie ran away from us and went to the States for three weeks. And I go to the school and ta-da, I'm no longer the pastor. I take the pastor hat off and I put on the teacher hat. And now I'm a teacher. And then later I take off the teacher hat and now I put on my college professor hat and I am now a college professor. This is modalism, because at no time is the teacher ever the professor and the professor ever the pastor. It bothers me tremendously, by the way, when folks in the church, we've got folks in the church that are associated with the school, if they call me teacher. I nip that in the bud. When I'm at the school, if anybody from the church is in the school and they call me teacher, no. She can call me teacher because she doesn't come to my church, but you call me pastor. I am your pastor. Because I want to make sure that they get it clear in their mind exactly what my position is. Okay? Now, in modalism, God is not always the Father. Sometimes He's the Father, sometimes He's the Son, sometimes He's the Holy Spirit, but He's never three in one. That's modalism. Yes, sir. In modalism, they're always just one. They are never three in one. It's just one in one with three different hats. Okay? All right. And of course, this is contrary to the teaching of the Trinity as found in the Scriptures. The Trinity is best expressed as three distinct persons in one. Now, going back to the 2nd century again, there were other significant changes. Now, you might ask yourself the question at this point, before I go any further, you might ask yourself the question, why are we going through this doctrinal stuff? Because in order to understand what the people of God were facing, we need to understand all that they were facing. We can't just go, well, the Jews were picking on them and the Romans were picking on them. It was worse than that. You see, the devil is no dummy. When he couldn't destroy them from without, he moved within. So now he is within, seeking to destroy from within. And he's been doing that since the 1st century. Remember, the reason why we have a letter called 1 Corinthians is because we had a church with problems. The reason why we have a letter called Galatians is because we had a church with problems. The reason we have the book of Colossians is because we have a church with problems. The 2nd and 3rd chapters of the book of Revelation is because we had 5 churches with problems and 2 good ones, right? So let's not get the idea that things started to go wrong in the 2nd century. No, things were going wrong in the 1st century, but in the 1st century, the apostles were there and they were able to fix a lot. But by the time we get to the 2nd century, what's happened? They've all died. Now we've got the 2nd string. We've got men like Polycarp. And then we have his disciple. Who was his disciple? Who? John. Okay, John the Apostle taught Polycarp, and Polycarp taught another guy whose name that we were just talking about earlier. Ignatius. Domitian was not a disciple. He was killing disciples. Yeah. All right, so back to the notes. There were other significant changes in the 3rd century. For example, the invention of other church offices, several classes of deacons. Do we see that today? Do we see several classes of deacons today? Yes or no? I don't know. Don't beat me. Yes, we do. if you go to a mainline Presbyterian church in Korea, I don't know about in America, but in Korea, they have several classes of elders. And they call them what? Chibsa. What's that in English? Deacon. So they're still doing that. They have created. Now, remember, there are two offices, according to Baptist distinctives, two offices, the pastor and the deacon. Those are the two offices whereby men are ordained to that office. We can have treasurers, they're not ordained. We can have Sunday school teachers, they are not ordained. We can have cooks in the kitchen. We can have, people on staff to be janitors or bus captains or whatever. We can have all of that. We need that kind of stuff sometimes. And we can appoint people to do those tasks. But as far as ordained offices, there's only two, the pastor and the deacon. And if you take the deacon office and you split it up into 3 or 4, you have created offices that are supposed to be ordained that the Bible doesn't have. Yes, sir. Because the Bible says it. Yeah. All right. So there's an ordination for deacons. Where are we at? So the invention of other offices, and then a ranking system. And again, I don't mean to pick on Korean churches because there are a lot of really good Korean Christian people that I know. So I'm not really, I'm not trying to slam them all. But the fact is there is a ranking in those deacons. There's deacons up at there's a higher level, and then there's the lower level of deacons. The same thing has been done to the office of the pastor, by the way. There's the pastor, and then we have an associate pastor, and then we have assistant pastors, and then we have the pastor of music and the pastor of youth pastor, and I got to tell you, I think we need to be very careful how we use words. If the Bible only tells us that there's one ordained position called the pastor, then that guy that they're calling youth pastor, I would much rather call a youth leader. The guy that they're calling the pastor of music, I would rather call him song leader. You see what I'm saying? So we need to be careful with words. Now, I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that. That's okay. I would rather err on the side of carefulness, if you understand what I'm saying. So the point is that no office created by the church elevates one man above another at any rate anyway, because we all have the priesthood of the believer. We all have individual soul liberty. The church at Rome, and again, we are now into the 2nd century, and remember what's happening in the world, okay? Get this in your mind in the world. We got down in Alexandria, we've got a theology center down there. We got a theology center in Antioch, and we've got Rome now. Rome has now taken center stage, if you will, on the world of Christendom. It has become a big name center for churches. The church at Rome, for numerous reasons, is now being highly regarded and was considered the seat of Christianity. Homework. Do not miss this homework assignment. If you miss this homework assignment, you will be lashed with a wet noodle 49 times. Okay? So do not miss this one. All right? Here's your homework assignment. Did Peter ever go to Rome? Was he the pastor in Rome? And if the answer is yes, what biblical support or historical document support do we have on that? Okay, so basically, I want you to research Peter's interaction with Rome. Did he go to Rome? Was he the pastor at Rome? And so forth. Don't miss that homework assignment. That is a big, big theological point of discussion in circles of theology today. Understand that you need to be careful in doing your research, because the Roman Catholic books will tell you that Peter was the first pope at Rome. But I'm asking you, to lay aside the teachings of men and find me something that says that is biblical, that we can trust. Okay? Any questions? All right, then we'll stop here. We'll pick up next week with the people of God, and we'll be looking at the Montanists and the Novatians. Okay? And with that, yeah, kill the video, and then we'll go ahead and close in prayer.